Hi everyone, I hope you're enjoying the long weekend. This is just a short introduction for you to watch before looking at Mean Girls to make sure you're across the concepts before you look at the film. Today we're looking at finding meaning, critical literacy and analysis. So as with everything you go into at university, it's important to bring your critical skill set to the text and to analyse the piece that you're watching. So this is a pretty famous text. I'm sure you know some of the phrases from it, some of the ideas and the way that it questions the impact the media has on our development, and the way that it's fed across into things like clothing and even memes. The film's been around for a bit over a decade now and it's had a huge cultural impact. So we're going to aim to look at it critically. As one of the readings for this week's notes, critical literacy means trying as much as possible to learn how things work, whether we're talking about the way language works to influence our opinions and our view of the world, or the way software works to influence our behaviour and relationships with other people. There's a clear link to critical thinking and textual analysis, and particularly as a university graduate, you want to have really good critical skills. It's something that employers look for, and it's a transferable skill set. We see that critical thinking is grounded in being able to unpack ideologies, to be able to look at what's behind a text, what meaning is trying to be conveyed. And this is often done in a way that's meant to be a bit difficult to spot. So this is helping giving you training in how to spot them. So in the textbook, they note that these are powerful systems of ideas, practices and social relationships. They govern what's considered right or wrong, good or bad, and normal or abnormal. Ideologies are not necessarily bad, but most people are unconscious of them, and they take the particular ideology they subscribe to as truth, rather than simply as one of many versions of reality. So it's an important quote to think about. What do we see as truth? How do we support that? And how do we know who's positioning us to interpret certain things as true? So media makers' choices often relate to ideology, particularly things like capitalism is a dominant ideology in many media texts. So when you're looking to unpack things and find the ideology behind them, it's important to ask who made it and why. And the media maker may have quite honourable intentions in the way they're putting things across. They may be trying to affect change, or they may be doing things that are perhaps there to manipulate people as well. So it's important to look at this to understand it. This critical analysis helps us to identify ideological positions and agendas. It helps us to understand why the texts were created, why they were made in the first place. It helps us to identify and avoid emotive and illogical statements. So those types of techniques that prey upon our emotion or feed into particular fears. It helps us to use perhaps more of a logical and rational approach when analysing these texts. And it helps us to identify and support reasonable and logical arguments. Anytime a person uses a semiotic system like language to make meaning, they always have an agenda, Jones and Hafner note. The first question to ask whenever we encounter a text is what the agenda of the person or people who produced the text is. So who made it and why did they make it? And we know that the text being depicted is never, the reality in the text is never a true reality. It's always a matter of selection. Whenever you take a photo, you always leave something out by the edge of the framing. Same whenever you construct any type of mediated text. And we can see that language is particularly a way that this is achieved. As Jones and Hafner note, language is basically a filter, a system of inclusion and exclusion. Whenever we choose to include or emphasise one thing and our version of reality, we're also choosing to exclude or downplay something else. So for example, if we look at this imagery, we can see the types of ideologies that are being put across. At first glance, it's an ad for a soft drink, and Coca-Cola are very good at advertising. They have a long history of advertising awards. It's telling us if we open a Coke, we open happiness, and it's wanting us to align the idea of happiness with their product. It also makes us want to believe that it's possible to purchase happiness, that it's as simple as putting a couple of dollars in a vending machine. So we can clearly see that the underlying ideology here is capitalism, because it's suggesting that we can purchase this particular emotion. Keep an eye out at other advertising things that you see around you. You'll notice particular ideologies come through. So it starts with language. For example, Karen says, on Wednesdays we wear pink. we can pull apart that language and go, it's quite simple, but it's also inclusive. If Katie wants to be a part of the plastics group, she needs to wear pink on Wednesdays as well and adopt this specific position of femininity in the high school. Whereas we can see with the coach saying, don't have sex, otherwise you will get pregnant and you will die. He's very much setting up an us and them type of positioning in the way that he's giving this language. It's very instructive, it's very direct. So it's important to note that language is always subjective. There's always ways that emotions come into play and selections that have been made. As you can see in this little comic here, if something's subjective, it means it relies on the subject's interpretation. One person might think a cake is delicious and someone else might hate it, and yet it's exactly the same thing. It's just down to the subject's interpretation. Whereas if something is objective, as shown in the comic as well, there's a straightforward truth to it. There's a particular meaning that can be gained. You can see here that both the characters agree that 4 is the objective truth of the number of items. So language is always subjective, and we always need to think about how it's constructed. We need to ask, why have these words been chosen, and what does this selection mean? What's the agenda behind it? We need to analyse selection and structure, as the textbook argues. So the proposition, what is it proposing? These are statements about the world and how it works. The ideational function, the ways in which this type of statement allows us to express our ideas about reality. The presupposition, so what's being presupposed in the statement people are making. As they note in the textbook, this is when, rather than asserting something directly, writers or speakers treat certain propositions as given. As Jones and Hafner note, texts promote ideologies, not just through how they represent the world, but also through how they represent relationships between people, what linguists call the interpersonal function of language. And we saw that clearly in the we and you statements in those previous screenshots. So we'll be looking at the text Mean Girls as a case study of applied critical literacy. After viewing this, we'll go through and explore and analyse this more in your tutorials this week. And it really is the story of a character, Katie, who moves into a new culture, how she experiences that culture and how it interacts with her own value set. The inspiration was a book called Queen Bees and Wannabes that was a best-selling book which analysed the experience of adolescent girls in high school in America and how their identity and popularity played into their sense of self. The screenwriter is Tina Fey, who I have to say is one of my personal idols. I think she's a fantastic writer, and she was the first female head writer of Saturday Night Live. So she has a long history in comedy writing. And the director was Mark Waters, and they've worked together to create this really cult text. There's a particular ideology behind this text, which is one reason we should look at it. Now, the ideology is feminism. You may hear some people talk about feminism in the way that this quote is presented. Obviously, this person has a particular agenda. In reality, feminism is actually about equality. And when you look at this text closely, you'll see the argument that's being made. If we look at this definition, it's a person who believes in the social, political, and economic equality of the sexes. And at this time, you might think, wow, is that still really necessary? However, statistics have come out recently which were showing you're more likely to be a CEO of a large company in Australia if your name is John than if you're a woman. Quite damning stuff. So it's important that we do work towards equality across all of these frontiers. So we see feminism is an ideology, and there are many feminisms. There's not just one type. So this film is particularly based in a liberal feminist ideology, which is about making the system work effectively from within. A couple of recent quotes about feminism to help you get your head around this particular ideology. The first one from Aziz Ansari notes that it's really important to use the correct terminology in these sorts of spaces. In his example, he talks about if you're a person, a medical doctor who deals with skin, and someone says, oh, so you're a dermatologist, and you said, oh, no, I don't like that word, that's way too sort of intense. It's the same sort of thing. If you believe in equality of the sexes, you're a feminist. That's how it works. As Emma Watson notes, For the record, feminism by definition is the belief that men and women should have equal rights and opportunities. So that's the kind of meaning that's coming across in this clip. And as Justin Trudeau noted in 2015, quite famously, why he was a feminist, because it's 2015, really. I think we can all agree on equality. So moving along, in terms of some of the messages that you see within this text, Wiseman notes about that issue of how these things become insidious, how perhaps a girl not being invited to a birthday party might start to lay the groundwork for popularity competitions. And Tina Fey gives quite a good explanation here, I think, about the film. She says, if there's any message to take away, I think it's just, like a lot of times, us girls are our own worst enemies, and it just doesn't have to be like that. You know, if Brittany and Christina can make up and write letters to each other, then we can all get along. So essentially, in looking at this film, you're looking at an outsider's transition to American teenage girl culture, exposing the rules and issues while ultimately suggesting a better way forward. There are some key meanings that come through, so it's interesting to look at three perspectives on it. So Gretchen, who says, ex-boyfriends are just off limits to friends. I mean, that's just like the rules of feminism. Interesting. Katie, who I think in her epiphany really captures the meaning of the film. And Miss Norbury, who notes in her piece, so I'll move out the way, that it's really important that we think about language, because using really strong and negative language makes it okay for other people to use language like that as well. So in terms of moving forward, the things to think about in your critical analysis, firstly, what is the narrative? What story are you seeing here? What's the moral or meaning of this story? And how does this connect to the ideology of liberal feminism? How do you see this conveyed through the text? Firstly, through mise-en-scène, through all the elements like lighting, staging, direction, these sorts of things. How do you see it through characterisation, through language and humour, and through themes and motifs? Make notes of these as you go through the film. So the types of things to help you out in terms of motif. And the idea with the motif is it's a repeated image or piece of other media, perhaps a piece of sound, or perhaps an idea, perhaps a word choice that carries particular symbolic meaning within the text. It represents something. So the types of things you might look for and the meanings, you might think about what meanings they have, include the school bus, the use of language, so things like plastics, what does that symbolise? The use of colour within the film, and this film uses colour very strongly. References to Africa, which appear quite a lot. The use of maths, why is this an important concept in the film? And what about costume and accessories? What do these represent? So enjoy analysing this film. I'll look forward to discussing it with you in class.